Now we're going to talk about what else? The race for mayor. Tripp Yang joins us now, of course, and we saw a big candidate roundtable this morning at Crain's, which is a business newspaper. And let's walk through some of the highlights. So we can start with Zohran Mamdani, the front runner. He laid out a plan for faster bus service. So this is part of his plan to make buses free in the city. And so after this event, he hopped on the 57th bus, which is the crosstown bus.
That was pretty smart, yeah.
Right, which is known as the slowest bus in the city, to sort of roll out the details of this plan. Walk us through how this would work and how you think this, what impact it would have on the race so far.
Of course. So Zohran Mamdani remains the front runner. Look, the mayor's race has been pretty static for the last 3 months. Even with the incumbent mayor, Eric Adams, dropping out, Mamdani is usually ahead of Cuomo by probably 18 to 20 points in the public polling. And look, what you have to give him credit for, whether you're a Democrat or not, is that Mamdani is unbelievably talented at walking into any room, including a room of business executives and CEOs, and saying, hey, if you elect me, I'll work with you.
And he knows this is sort of a hostile room for him. These are the people who are probably most opposed to him, right? When he walks into this room, he has to put on the charm for an event like this.
Yeah, well, that's why he's got the Riz, as the kids say. He's the Rizzler. But look, he even said this morning, if you thought there was going to be a dream candidate for mayor, you probably were not thinking about me. That's what he said to this room full of business executives. He's incredibly good at expanding the coalition, expanding electorate. One of his many strengths, frankly, as a mayoral candidate.
So let's walk through sort of the particulars on this. So he was joined, he got support from the Transit Workers Union, who say that this will make their employees working on these buses safer. And he also said this plan would make bus service faster, basically just sort of throwing more resources at this issue. More people on and off means less sort of vagrant people just hanging out, causing disruptions on the buses. Is that sort of the gist of that?
One of the reasons why he's such a good candidate and why I am optimistic about a Mamdani mayoralty is that fast and free buses, of course, it requires funding from Albany, but it actually doesn't require as much funding as people think. And by the way, when he was an assembly member a couple years ago, he actually got a successful bus pilot for this program implemented in the state budget a couple years ago. He, of course, talks about it in a very populist, accessible way. Every New Yorker deserves this, but incredibly smart, talented. He's very ambitious, but in a way that this is actually a very achievable policy goal.
Right, and he sort of talked about that pilot program. That was what when he was asked about, would this make things slower, and whatnot. He sort of went to that pilot, which he said made things safer and actually kind of sped things up, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, here in New York, a lot of our places, a lot of our neighborhoods, they're transportation deserts in terms of, we don't have an MTA train station. Not everyone is in a position to drive. Of course, there's also congestion pricing. So, the cost of buses is much, much less expensive than the cost and the timeline of building a new train station. So this is very, very smart. And by the way, it's been done before on a smaller scale, which he was the bill sponsor for that. So very, very smart politics.
Yeah, we've seen what an ordeal it is, even just getting accessible elevators into all these stations. It costs a fortune, takes forever. So yeah, maybe the bus is a good way to work. And he was joined on that bus trip by Jerry Nadler, who sort of took some shots at Cuomo because he accused him, when he was governor, of sort of using the MTA as his piggy bank and stealing it for other unrelated projects.
Yeah, Andrew Cuomo, when he was governor, look, he's had a litany of allegations when he was governor. One of them that's not talked about as much until recently is that he really transferred hundreds of millions of dollars from the MTA's budget when he was governor to something else. Of course, if you don't like him, you don't use the word transferred. But look, Jerry Nadler, iconic Manhattan Congress member, his endorsement means a great deal. And look, the reason why Mamdani is so active on the campaign trail, even though he's a front runner, is that he's not taking anything for granted. If this becomes a one-on-one race, which I don't think it will be, but in case it does, if Sliwa drops out, if it's Cuomo versus Mamdani, it does tighten up a little bit. So Zohran Mamdani is clearly running through the finish line.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, that sort of whole dynamic sort of shows the difference between being governor of the state and mayor. Of course, as governor, maybe you are tempted to look at New York City as this massive pot of money that can solve problems elsewhere. Of course, it'll be a much different role if you were to actually be mayor. Now, let's talk about Andrew Cuomo certainly making big-time headlines out of this, calling for this plan to rebuild Rikers instead of the plan which is currently in process as we speak to build these smaller borough-based jails in all 5 boroughs. Now, I mean, where did this come from? Because this plan is already
Yeah.
well underway, right?
Yeah, look, the borough-based jail program was actually passed in 2019 when Bill de Blasio and a previous city council, this is the previous city council to the one now, they passed it. They passed it pretty overwhelmingly. Now, there's 4 borough-based jails. The popularity of each of these areas depends on the borough, depends on the neighborhood. The one in Manhattan, Chinatown, for example, is pretty unpopular.
Right.
The one in some of the outer boroughs, maybe a little bit more popular. But look, what Cuomo was really, really trying to do, let's take away all the complexities here. What he's trying to do is attack Zohran Mamdani he's basically saying if you elect Mamdani mayor, the streets will be more unsafe. The criminals, so-called, will be running the streets close to schools, close to families. I don't know how real this is. This feels like an 11th hour desperation attack.
Yeah, interesting. It did sort of seem to come out of the blue. And of course, we also heard him make some noise because we know the issue of gifted and talented. The program in public schools has been a huge campaign issue since Mamdani, about a week or so ago, mentioned he wanted to stop enrollment as young as kindergarten, push it back a little bit. Obviously, a lot of parents whose kids are in the program or whatnot, that became a real flashpoint on the campaign trail. So Cuomo instead saying he wanted to double the number of seats in gifted and talented, and Sliwa was sort of taking something along those lines too, to fight back against the plan by Mamdani. A week or so after that announcement, where do you think we are on the politics of gifted and talented among the voters?
Education politics has always been very, very tricky. Gifted and talented, and really its sister issue, the specialized high school exams here in New York, long been a divisive issue with outer borough families, with a lot of Asian American families as well. I would just say this. The Mamdani campaign does most things very flawlessly. That's why they're in the commanding position. But my unsolicited advice would be probably stay away from some of these divisive, hedge issues. Specifically here in New York, the Asian American community, which is the fastest growing demographic in New York, when Bill de Blasio was mayor, he tried many, many times to end gifted and talented, to end the specialized high school exams. A lot of Asian American communities felt like the mayor de Blasio at the time did not listen to their concerns, was trying to steamroll policy to communities. I would just urge, if Mamdani becomes mayor, don't replicate this approach by former Mayor de Blasio.
Right, I think that whole issue sort of came up. That was a mayoral a form he had filled. He'd been given a request for his positions on a number of different issues, and that's how that sort of came to the forefront. That wasn't an issue he was particularly trying to push out there, right? That was
it wasn't necessarily an issue he was trying to push out there. I will say this though, in a political campaign, myself as a professional strategist, having worked on over 50 campaigns here in New York, whatever you put in writing always has the potential to get out there in public.
Sure,
so sometimes when you fill out these completed questionnaires, probably use some more, use a little more careful language.
Yeah, no, for sure, right. It can be overwhelming, I'm sure, the amount of questionnaires you're asked to fill out. You never know which one's going to get sort of momentum in the race. All right, and then Curtis Sliwa, of course, was also there without the beret, and he was basically, the headline from him, as far as I could tell, was that he basically accused Cuomo of flip-flopping, on some of his issues, including that plan for the borough jails that sort of, as we mentioned, did seem to sort of come out of nowhere at this event.
Look, I got to say, Curtis Sliwa, without the beret, his hair looks pretty good. I forgot how he looks like without it. He's got a, he looks like a charming man. But look, there is no love lost between Curtis Sliwa and Andrew Cuomo. It just seems like Curtis Sliwa is the last stumbling block for Cuomo to try to complete his comeback. The reality of the situation is that most Republican voters in New York City actually like the Republican nominee, Curtis Sliwa. He actually is the Republican. Cuomo's not actually a Republican. And so because Sliwa's in the race, gobbling up most of these Republican votes, Mamdani's gobbling up most of Democratic votes, as you would expect the respective nominees to, Cuomo's kind of in political no man's land. And Sliwa, is really an obstacle for Cuomo here.
Right, Cuomo's sort of trying to find a different place to land, a different lily pad in between the two parties, which already had this sort of well-known, certainly, political and policy positions. And just before we let you go, I do know